Dien Bien Phu is fallen. Its defense of 57 days and nights will go down in history as one of the most heroic of all time. The defenders, composed of French and native forces, inflicted staggering losses on the enemy, and the French soldiers showed that they have not lost either the will or the skill to fight, even under the most terrible conditions.
Since 1954, Vietnam has been divided into North and South along the 17th parallel. The North is led by Ho Chi Minh, who is fighting to unify all of Vietnam.
The partition of the country into two parts, which the leaders in the North, primarily Ho Chi Minh, simply refused to accept. It was always their goal to reunite Vietnam as a single country.
More than just a national conflict, the fighting in Vietnam is also a front line in the global Cold War between America and Russia.
The American interest in the Vietnam War was directly related to the Cold War. It was to prevent Soviet influence in Asia.
They thought if South Vietnam fell, next to fall would be Indonesia and the Philippines, and all of Asia would become communist.
By
March 1975, the North Vietnamese army heads south on its way to capture Saigon.
Fear, just incredible, and it was like a chain reaction.
South Vietnamese civilians and army deserters flee from the onrushing invaders. Anxious crowds hammer at the gates of the American embassy, hoping for a way out.
The terror and fear in people's eyes, particularly those that were outside, was obvious.
April 30th, 1975. As the enemy approaches Saigon, after more than 20 years, the war is about to end.
There was a panic at first, and then it was almost a sort of fatalism took over. The end was inevitable, and there's nothing they could do about it.
I'm Jack Smith, and these are stories of the Vietnam War, told by the people who know it best, those who fought it. I was one of them. Tonight, we'll look at the tumultuous end of that war in April 1975. There are stories of tragedy and broken promises, but also of courage during chaos and lives touched by uncommon bravery. By 1973, the last American combat troops were gone from Vietnam. The Americans still there were advisors, embassy workers, and guards around U.S. installations. And by 1975, Hanoi was ready for the last push south, the final offensive. Early in March 1975, North Vietnamese troops capture the central highland city of Ban Mi Thuot, 165 miles northwest of Saigon. Hanoi's strategy is to cut the country in half. South Vietnamese morale is poor. Many units have not been paid in months. With no U.S. troops to stiffen them and facing Hanoi's cracked divisions, the South Vietnamese army breaks. And South Vietnamese President Thieu unaccountably orders the army to abandon the strategic Central Highlands. Frightened refugees and soldiers clog the roads across the center of Vietnam and south to Saigon. By March 16th, the flight of panicked Vietnamese becomes known as the Convoy of Tears. Ken Kashiwahara is there for ABC News.
All you would see would be people carrying what looked to be everything they owned on their backs or pulling it along carts, heading south. I mean, it was an incredible convoy, if you will, of people who were abandoning their homes, abandoning the safety of wherever they lived, and just moving. I'm not sure whether they knew where they were moving. All I think they knew was they were moving south. And so the roads were just clogged with people carrying anything they could and heading south.
Demoralized Southern soldiers lead the flight through the mountain passes of central Vietnam as North Vietnamese troops continue their relentless march toward Saigon. Walter Sparks, a Marine Guard stationed at the American consulate in Da Nang, 380 miles from Saigon, recalls the mood of the people.
You could see that panic. And it was almost like they didn't need to run, but because everybody else was running, I'm going to run too. A lot of soldiers would throw their uniform away and their weapons, put on their black pajamas, and go home.
Frank Snepp, a CIA military analyst in South Vietnam, knew earlier than most that the South Vietnamese army would not stand and fight.
The CIA at the end of March, 1 month before the end, predicted that the South Vietnamese army could not hold, and it made a lot of sense because half of it had already collapsed in one 2-week period. I flew over the retreating South Vietnamese army in the northern part of the country, and they were literally running into the surf.
The army just kind of busted up, and everybody, the Vietnamese took their families with them. So they clouded Highway 1, which is coming into Da Nang, coming south. And I went up with an Air America pilot, and we could see what they call the Hai Van Pass, which is coming out of Highway 1 on down. It was just thronged. And I said to myself then, he and I both said, this is all she wrote.
In December 1974, feeling confident it can end the war, Hanoi decides to test Saigon's and America's will. That month, North Vietnam captures the sparsely populated province of Phuoc Long, only 66 miles north of the capital. To Hanoi's surprise, the South Vietnamese and the United States do not react to its bold move. Meeting with little resistance, North Vietnam then launches its massive conventional armored assault against South Vietnam. Its troops are all regular army, thus ending the myth of guerrilla warfare forever. North Vietnamese tanks overrun one city after another. The old imperial city of Hue, mostly destroyed during the Tet Offensive in 1968, is shelled, and now there are more than 250,000 frightened refugees jamming the road south. With no American troops in Vietnam, Congress has drastically cut money and supplies to Saigon. Under attack, the South Vietnamese military is fast running out of arms and ammunition. South Vietnam's President Thieu orders his armed forces to abandon Hue, 398 miles north of Saigon. On March 26th, 16 days into their offensive, the communists raise their flag over that ancient city for the first time since the Tet Offensive. It is now impossible to stem the flow of refugees as the people move headlong down the coast. As many as 6,000 Americans, among them government officials, construction workers, and journalists, still remain in South Vietnam. They begin to worry about their fate, but all they can do is watch and wait, unsure of the outcome. General Homer Smith commanded troops in Da Nang in 1969 and 1970, and he is now the United States Defense Attaché to the South Vietnamese government.
When the North Vietnamese closed the Hai Van Pass, people had to come out by ocean, and so it was almost another Dunkirk. The capabilities of Da Nang were just not enough to support that big a population, and so we actually sent merchant ships up there to help evacuate the people who were coming out.
People of all ages crowd into small boats, barges, and freighters that choke the coastline.
So chaotic that there were people throwing babies at the barges and missing, and the babies were falling in the water, and we're letting the women up with babies, and some of the old people first, and we'd take the baby, put them in a water bucket, and pull them up to the side of the ship. In the meantime, their mamas would get up the side, and we'd have to beat back some of the other people. They were really panicking. They were afraid we were going to leave them.
Chaos mounts at the Da Nang airport. People are desperate to get out. George Esper covers the story for the Associated Press.
One evacuation plane from Da Nang had a South Vietnamese clinging to the landing gear. And it was that kind of panic, I think, that really lost the war. The scenes were tumultuous.
Private individuals try to help. World Airways President Ed Daly offers to evacuate high-risk Vietnamese civilians who work for the Americans and fear reprisals from the North Vietnamese. Hysteria results when almost 300 men, mostly Army deserters, force their way aboard Daly's plane, the last evacuation flight to Saigon. March 30th, Da Nang falls. South Vietnam's second largest city, only 380 miles from Saigon, is in North Vietnam's hands. Nothing except time stands in the way of Hanoi's headlong drive toward the capital.
When Da Nang fell, the South Vietnamese army gave up. That's when it really went into disarray. There were thousands of desertions, and the commanders were bugging out and trying to flee, and there was no one in command.
They were panicking and mad at the same time. The way they treated their own people, they didn't bother the Americans, but the way they were treating their own people, I saw them slap them, hit them with rifles, shoot them, break into stores, just basically do whatever they felt like they wanted to do.
The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were sort of taking over the country, and it seemed like from the top to the bottom. There's sort of this wave coming down the country. And at one point, I remember we flew up to Quy Nhon, which is on the central coastline. Spent the night there. There was no, people were just leaving the city.
Off in the distance, I can hear artillery fire, and that just seems to quicken the tempo of exodus from this city.
So I remember going to the airport and finding the airport absolutely deserted. The control tower was deserted. Everybody was gone because the North Vietnamese were coming into the town.
Kashiwahara and his crew talk their way onto one of the last flights to Saigon.
I sat on the floor and flew back to Saigon. So I think beginning at that point, it was clear to me that the whole country was sort of crumbling.
Though many Americans and Vietnamese know the country is doomed, there are still American officials in the capital who hide from the truth. Ambassador Graham Martin tries to deny the possibility of the coming defeat.
The ambassador had imposed his view on the American community, trying to convince all of us to stay calm, not to panic, not to pack up, because he felt that would send the wrong signal to the South Vietnamese themselves. So very few of the Americans in the official community really knew what was going on.
There's no television. There were damn few radios. There were no newspapers. So the only words they got were through the grapevine and down that way.
The mood was otherworldly. I had a sense that no one really appreciated the danger. I, since I was reading all the intelligence, had a totally different view, and I began to get very concerned that this imposed sense of unreality would cause us never to plan for an evacuation.
But General Homer Smith is handling the evacuation of South Vietnamese who have an American connection, either through work or marriage. Everyone fears a coming bloodbath by the marauding North Vietnamese. Initially, Smith and his staff fly out some 200 Vietnamese a day. But with the North Vietnamese army getting closer to Saigon by the hour, General Smith keeps evacuating more refugees. On April 2nd, Ed Daly of World Airways again decides to assist the evacuation on his own. This time, he flies out 58 orphans who would be left behind when Saigon falls. His unauthorized flight gets so much publicity, it becomes a goad to action inside the Ford White House. The State Department tells General Smith to start evacuating thousands more Vietnamese orphans. On April the 4th, 1975, a specially equipped Air Force C-5A transport is loaded with 226 orphans, most of them babies. Escorting the orphans to their new homes in the United States are 77 Americans, most of them secretaries from the U.S. Embassy. So begins Operation Baby Lift with fanfare and hope. But once in the air, the flight is in trouble.
Got out over the South China Sea, about 20,000 feet, and the rear ramp blew off. When it did, it damaged the control surfaces on the tail.
With his plane in distress, the pilot makes a decision to turn back to Saigon.
The young captain who was flying it turned it around, brought it back into land, and he lost it short of the runway, short of the Saigon River, jumped the river, crashed, and that was it. I recall my exec coming in and saying, "Boss, we have a disaster. The C-5 just crashed toward the air base," and you could look out and you could see the smoke coming in.
138 die in the crash, including 78 orphans, 39 civilians and military, and 11 crew members.
We set up a morgue over at the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital, brought bodies over there. We had a few survivors, and they were taken to the hospital. It was a shattering incident.
Marine Steve Hasty takes part in the rescue operation and cannot forget what he saw.
I can remember when we were taking the body parts off the helicopters. We would run forward with stretchers and basically just scrape the body parts off the deck of the helicopter and onto the stretchers, and then cover it with a sheet.
Although the first baby lift is an unexpected catastrophe, the United States continues to successfully fly out thousands more orphans. On April 4th, the day of the baby lift disaster, President Thieu goes on television and attacks America for letting down his country. He blames his military and his people for fleeing the communist juggernaut, but he never accepts responsibility for his own failures. Calls for Thieu's resignation grow louder, but he holds fast to his weakened presidency as the communists race toward Saigon, where people wander the strangely quiet streets of the city. The mood is uncertain. Hundreds of thousands of people and South Vietnamese troops converge on the capital. The United States prevails on South Vietnam to seal off the city so it will not be overrun with refugees and become even more impossible to govern. Though South Vietnam is on the brink of disaster, there is still no announced plan for the evacuation of the more than 6,000 Americans who remain in the country. But in the South China Sea, more ships join the U.S. 7th Fleet every day. By April the 7th, only 28 days after the start of the Communist offensive, everyone waits for the Americans to begin their own evacuation and finally abandon South Vietnam. Everyone waits to see how long it will take Hanoi to capture its most coveted prize, Saigon. The first week in April, North Vietnamese troops control most of the country north and west of Saigon. They are closer than ever to taking the capital. Then on April the 8th, there is a stunning event.
Saw this jet airplane flying very low. And jet airplanes don't fly over the city. They never had before. And then I saw something falling out of this airplane down in the area of the palace. And I said, oh my God.
And all of a sudden, 2 bombs dropped off of it. And I'm going, I don't believe this. And about that time, boom, boom, they landed over the palace.
The presidential palace. It is an ominous attack.
That was a shock because, first of all, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese didn't have airplanes, so there was never any fear of attack from the air. It was always on the ground.
Behind the controls of a captured American jet is a dissident South Vietnamese Air Force pilot, not the North Vietnamese. The damage to the palace is slight, escape injury, but it does not help morale as people wonder what will be next.
The airstrike on the presidential palace signified that there was no impunity for Saigon. Even the palace itself was vulnerable.
After weeks of refusing to see the oncoming defeat, people sense the end is near.
People actually thought there was going to be a bloodbath. Even to this day, I'd never seen anything like this. The fear was just incredible, and it was like a chain reaction.
But there is still some fight in Saigon's troops. Starting April the 10th at the town of Xuan Loc, only 38 miles northeast of Saigon, 5,000 South Vietnamese army troops go into battle against 40,000 hardened North Vietnamese soldiers.
I will hold Long Can. I will knock them down here, even to bring here 2 divisions or 3 divisions.
Though these South Vietnamese forces give Saigon a burst of hope, the battle at Xuan Loc will be nothing more than a holding action. Everyone now wants Thieu to resign. Everyone except the American ambassador, Graham Martin. He says Thieu is the only president South Vietnam has, and he should stay in office. Ambassador Martin, who has been out of the country recuperating from an illness, takes an unrealistic view of Saigon's impending fate.
He'd missed the first part of the communist offensive. And I said, Mr. Ambassador, half of the South Vietnamese army is gone. He said, well, Frank, I think not. I think your intelligence is mistaken. So the ambassador had a different point of view, and why not? His son had died in Vietnam. He was a cold warrior of the old stripe, and he was determined to hold that line. He wasn't going to give up South Vietnam.
And he was not going to plan for, let alone order, an evacuation. Martin believes if people see America planning an evacuation, it will create panic. No matter what Martin thinks, some American officials take action without his knowledge or approval.
Most of the evacuation plans were done by my staff. We were the ones that were interfacing with the Marines and with the Navy. In fact, the ambassador was not overly enthused about an evacuation.
Tony Wood, a member of General Homer Smith's Special Planning Group, makes the evacuation plans.
All evacuation planning under General Smith went underground and was was largely done in secret from the public actions taken at the embassy. General Smith ordered the evacuation. He was in charge of the evacuation preparations, which were not briefed to the ambassador because of the ambassador's insistence that no evacuation would be planned.
At first, no one knows who the evacuees will be or how many will be allowed to leave.
We identified about over 25,000 people for which the U.S. had responsibility to evacuate from Saigon. And what followed, what was called the black evacuation and the unreported evacuation, in which that actual community was reduced to about 5,800, or somewhere close to that, for the final evacuation.
Plans go forward. There are briefings on meeting places, secret bus routes, and secret messages to be broadcast over the American radio service. Bing Crosby singing White Christmas will be the signal for everyone to leave, and leave quickly. Wood trains volunteers in secret to handle the evacuation.
The fact that we had volunteers and not military personnel was because the ambassador would not permit any active evacuation planning or training. So we had to make do with American citizens who would volunteer to perform the evacuation of the American mission.
As the North Vietnamese close in on Saigon, many believe the final evacuation will come sooner than anyone expects. April the 15th, the Communists blow up the ammunition dump at Bien Hoa Air Base, only 22 miles from Saigon. April 16th, over Graham Martin's objections, President Ford tells the American embassy that all non-essential persons must leave Saigon. April 18th, an advance guard of North Vietnamese soldiers attacks the outskirts of Saigon. By now, the Communists control 2/3 of the country, and the main North Vietnamese force is only 100 miles from the capital. April 21st, after 11 days of hard combat at Xuan Loc, the remaining 600 South Vietnamese troops go down fighting. Xuan Loc falls. That night, President Thieu goes on television, and in a final scathing anti-American speech, he resigns as president of South Vietnam.
When I arrived at the house, at the mansion, all of a sudden a number of Thieu's aides came running across the driveway with bags, heavy bags. And you could hear the tinkle of metal hitting metal like wind chimes. He was moving his gold out of the country, reportedly $14 million worth. Then I caught the whiff of whiskey in the car. Thieu had been drinking heavily. He had shipped out most of his favorite art to Hong Kong. He was moving his gold out of the country, and he started weeping. He started weeping.
Thieu is a broken man fleeing a country on the brink of defeat. Despite Ambassador Graham Martin's futile hope of a peaceful settlement, on the streets and around the American embassy, the number of people clamoring to get out increases tenfold. Hanoi is ready to move in for the kill, while Saigon and Washington hold their breath. It is April 21st, 1975. President Thieu is gone, but the North Vietnamese will not negotiate with his hand-picked successor, nor with the Americans. Hanoi's ultimatum: all Americans must leave. It even delays its final push into Saigon to give them time to get out, but the evacuation is already underway. By April 22nd, 1975, only 44 days into their assault on South Vietnam, Hanoi knows it can easily take the capital. But it delays a final military strike, fearing American reprisals if Americans die in their attack. In Saigon on April the 25th, Colonel Harry Summers assesses the mood of the capital.
It was almost sort of fatalism took over. The end was inevitable, and there's nothing they could do about it. And there was some quasi-panic at the U.S. Embassy, probably people trying to get in the embassy, but the rest of the town was quiet. I mean, very quiet, as a matter of fact, strangely quiet.
In Washington, President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger are nervous.
So we were getting all these calls from Washington saying, get this person out, get that person out, get the other person out. They had lists of people they wanted to evacuate it. So we ran a lot of, I guess what could be called black operations of picking people up, specific people, and evacuating them.
Despite careful planning, there is no guarantee if and when there will be a mass departure of Americans and Vietnamese.
We fully assumed after about the 20th of April that it could come at any time. We were literally sleeping in an hour or so at a time from that day on because of the tense situation in the country.
Despite the fear and tension, the flights from Tan Son Nhut Airport outside Saigon, protected by U.S. Marines, are still orderly. People wait 3 or 4 days to get out, and there is no panic. But for the final evacuation to run smoothly, the planners have other concerns.
Our concern in Saigon was that you cannot predict the rate of collapse, and the city was so large and had the population so intense at this point that we thought we would only have, at best, 12 hours after we began in order to complete our actions.
The strategy is to move people by helicopter and buses to the airport. They select more than a dozen meeting places and pickup points. They name bus routes in some hills of the Old West, Chisholm and Oregon. And who do not know how to drive a bus become drivers.
The whole concept here was to try to bring out as many people as possible on the evacuation routes using armored buses, which we had armored inside so they didn't show. That worked, as it turned out, pretty well.
In the last days of April, Big Min, a former general and an opponent of Nguyen Van Thieu, becomes the leader of what remains of South Vietnam. Hanoi is willing to negotiate with Big Min, but the superstitious general will take office only when the planets are properly aligned. But Hanoi cannot wait. In the pre-dawn hours of April 27th, enemy rockets hit Saigon's waterfront, partly destroy a Saigon slum. The noose tightens around the desperate city. Saigon is very tense. John Valdez is one of 11 Marines at the American Embassy, where crowds gather hoping for a way out.
There were people all around all the gates in the embassy, you know, people trying to get out, and there was a lot of traffic. I remember that very well, which made it very, very hard for some of the vehicles that were still evacuating people to Tan Son Nhut, or even the buses, made it very, very difficult for them to move.
At Tan Son Nhut Airport, Marine Ted Murray senses a mood of uncertainty as people still wait calmly for the next plane out.
Everybody had a fatalistic attitude of, this is the end, let's get out of here. Everybody knew from the past couple of weeks that it was just a question of time. How much time do we have? How much time is left? How many people can we get out? Everybody wanted to get out.
April 28th, Hanoi blasts Saigon's Newport Bridge with rockets. South Vietnamese troops clash with North Vietnamese infantry trying to cross the bridge into the city. Early on the morning of April the 29th, communist rockets fall on Tan Son Nhut Airport.
Well, one of those rockets blew my wife and me out of bed. I heard them coming in. It shook us up. We were not hurt. We got up, we got dressed, and we went over to our operations center.
The rocket attack at 0400 on that morning was a wake-up call that the end was closer than we all thought.
Those rockets take the lives of the last 2 American soldiers to die in combat in South Vietnam. Marine Corporal Charles McMahon Jr. and Marine Lance Corporal Darwin W. Judge take a direct hit on their guard post near the main gate of the airport.
It brought home the fact that what was going to happen, what could happen to all of us, the severeness of the situation, and the fact that this wasn't a game, this was something that had finally touched us. It wasn't across the street now. 2 of our own had died, and it kind of sobered us up.
Ambassador Martin decides to see the damage for himself. His Marine bodyguard, Colin Broussard, is with him.
We locked and loaded our rifles and machine guns, and we went down the main street to Ton Snuit Air Base. At that time, artillery rounds were landing on the air base. Smoke was coming up from some of the destroyed aircraft, and the ambassador could see firsthand what was going on.
Clearly, the runways are beyond repair, and after conferring with General Homer Smith, Martin calls Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in Washington and tells him he will end all fixed-wing flights from Saigon. So begins the evacuation by helicopter between Saigon and the fleet in the South China Sea. Pilot James Bolton starts flying that day and doesn't rest until he completes his mission.
There was a lot of burning, black smoke coming up from the airport. They had been shelling the airport for some time. That's why the helicopters were going in now, because the shells were coming in on the airfield. The runways had been damaged, so fixed wing was terminated. Helicopters, of course, we were already in the air now, and it was a go.
We had no problems whatsoever out of Ton Snuit. No crying mothers, screaming grandmothers, no. We had a little bit of consternation that morning because 2 more of those rockets, one of them landed up there and wounded a couple of people.
Pilots call the helicopter landing zone at Ton Snuit Airport the Alamo. It is America's last stand at what was formerly one of the busiest airports in the world. When all designated evacuees are finally in the air, the helicopter pilots then shift their attention to the American Embassy. Operation Frequent Wind is about to begin. Dawn is approaching on April 29, 1975. North Vietnamese troops surround Saigon. Ambassador Graham Martin now invokes Operation Frequent Wind, the final curtain on America's long years in Vietnam. Though unhappy, Martin realizes all is lost. The evacuation is on. Prearranged signals go out over the radio. Bing Crosby sings White Christmas. People take one overnight bag and hurry to their departure point.
How much baggage, Captain? Will you please, one small handbag. Can we please board the bus, ladies and gentlemen?
The convoys began moving and picking up people on their assigned routes. Got lost several times. It wasn't hard to get lost in the confusion of Saigon that day. By and large, they functioned very well. There were mobs running in different directions. There was a lot of shooting going on in terms of, I think most of it in the air, but you couldn't tell. We had a bus flipped over by a mob. You don't know the power of a mob until you see a bus picked up and thrown over. And eventually they picked up my Jeep and threw it over, so we had to get off and find our way to a bus.
Men and women make their way to rooftop landing zones around the city. Helicopters arrive to load passengers for their flight to freedom.
We still brought about 1,200 people off the roofs of these fortified buildings which also had radios, sea rations, and water placed on the roofs well in advance.
Outside the gates of the embassy, traffic is snarled. Inside, there is disorder.
There was thousands of people jammed within the walls of the embassy, totally unplanned for. And the embassy had no idea whatsoever what to do with it.
And the crowds got bigger and bigger, larger and larger, you know. More people wanted to get out. The people were pretty much panicked. They all wanted to get out of there, you know. We're rushing them to the choppers, putting them on, the choppers taking off, another one's landing. We're getting 60 more people there.
A sea of humanity surrounds the gates and walls of the embassy, threatening to engulf it.
You had hundreds, thousands of Vietnamese pushing toward the fence surrounding the embassy. It was a 14-foot wall. The Marines on the other side were in danger of being stampeded. And you had this same scene of the Marines kicking them and hitting them with rifle butts.
Major Jim Keene is in charge of the 11 Marines at the American Embassy.
There were people trying to pay off the Marines on the wall. A Chinese businessman had a brown paper sack full of uncut gems. He handed up to the Marine, and then he handed a baby up. All he wanted to do was send the baby up, and the Marine just, you know, he handed him back his sack and the child and said, "I can't do it."
Tension increases as Jerry Berry pilots his packed helicopter non-stop between the 7th Fleet and the American Embassy, a round trip of 3 hours.
This is absolute chaos. One, the crowd is not getting any smaller. If anything, it's getting larger. And it's kind of like a bottomless pit. Every time you land, there's more people there than there were before.
And there were a bunch of goons, we called them cowboys, that were deserters and so on, that were armed, that were shooting. And we could see the tracers, and a lot of the helicopters were shot, had holes in them. And it was very disconcerting because one crash and it was over.
Fearing revenge from the North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese soldiers desert in droves. They discard their uniforms and change into civilian clothes. Then they become part of the crowds warily wandering the streets. Along with other Saigonese, they break into and loot the main American commissary and deserted American residences.
You've got these soldiers and civilians running around looting American apartment buildings that the Americans had evacuated. They were taking refrigerators, stereos, any leftover food. These people were thugs. I mean, they really were. They were hoods.
The last-minute evacuation by helicopter is surprisingly orderly, but there is confusion and shock among the Vietnamese. Families separate. They arrive on different ships, and some relatives are left behind. Toby Hainsworth is a sailor aboard the carrier Midway when refugees arrive.
The people themselves were very subdued. They were quiet. It seemed to me there was a mixture of a relief that they had gotten out, fatigue, because many of them had traveled many miles to get to Saigon in hopes of getting out one way or the other, sadness at having left home.
Suddenly, a flood of South Vietnamese Army helicopters carrying unauthorized refugees fills the skies over the South China Sea. Gunnery Sergeant Russell Thurman has a front row seat on his evacuation helicopter.
Guy was like black with helicopters. So, needless to say, tensions were kind of high because those helicopters were trying to land on our ship.
It was just amazing to see them flying out in hopes of finding the fleet and in hopes of being rescued. They had no guarantees.
Each rogue helicopter carries women, children, grandmothers. All are low on fuel. 2 and sometimes 3 try to land on the ships at the same time. Some ditch at sea. sailors must push the helicopters over the side to make room for new arrivals.
This helicopter landed and all these people came off, and they were going to push the helicopter over the side, which, because we had just maxed out deck space, and they were about to push over the side, and one woman just went berserk. And we had Vietnamese interpreters with us, and we got one of them to find out why she'd gone hysterical, because they were pushing the helicopter over the side, and she finally got it known, and she went over and pulled a baby out from underneath the seat. It was a moment of just immense emotion.
At the American Embassy, Ambassador Martin, the one man most against the evacuation, is himself now ordered by President Ford to leave Saigon. Major Jim Keane delivers President Ford's message to Martin.
Came and I said, the president directs that you leave. And he looked up and he had these glasses on. He looked up over his glasses and he had this stare that he could freeze people with. And he said, all in good time, young Major. We had lowered the flag and put it in a brown paper sack and gave it to him. And with that, he went up and got on a helicopter about 4 o'clock in the morning.
By this time, Graham Martin was, I guess, best described in a daze. I mean, his world had collapsed.
He was absolutely exhausted. But you had to respect Ambassador Martin. You know, he kept us cool.
Martin and his staff fly out to the carrier Midway.
I remember when he came off, when he came around the side, just absolutely a very haggard, very tired guy that had obviously been in a very stressful position for a very, very, very long period of time.
Elsewhere, on a small island off the coast, South Vietnamese Air Force Major Bung Le loads his wife and 5 children on a single-engine plane and flies out in search of the fleet. The plane is running out of gas when the carrier Midway looms into view, its deck crowded with helicopters.
I don't have no way to communicate with the control tower. I try to use all the sign language to ask them, give me a chance to land.
He had to make 3 passes before he finally got a note to the ship. And it was taken up to the bridge, and basically he said, I've got my wife and 5 children. Would you please clear your runway? I want to land.
And I asked them, try to rescue my family, move the helicopter, and I believe I can land on that carrier.
The Navy clears the deck of helicopters so the small plane can land.
And as he came across the flight deck, the little plane fluttered. He landed it on the carrier perfectly. And out comes the Major, his wife, and step ladder, and 5 little kids that came out. It was a tremendously dramatic moment.
Without warning, Washington ends the airlift prematurely, leaving behind 460 people at the American Embassy in Saigon.
We abandoned the firemen who had volunteered to stay to the very end in case there was a helicopter crash. We abandoned this German priest with his refugee children. We abandoned the CIA people from the Korean embassy who were all executed later. It was just a very distasteful thing, and it was done by accident. It was done not by design, but because there was a breakdown in communication. It was the Vietnam War in microcosm. Great intentions and poor performance.
But 11 American Marines still remain at the embassy. They booby-trap the stairways and make their way to the roof. Vietnamese looters are already inside the embassy. Fully armed Marines hunker down and wait for 2 more hours before a helicopter arrives to carry them to the 7th Fleet.
We waited and we watched the sun come up, and we saw Big Min and his motorcade come down the main street.
Well, we can still see all the chaos going down there. Masses of people on the street, cars, the confusion in the embassy compound. By this time, you could see the North Vietnamese tanks that are coming by the side that are on their way to a presidential palace.
There was a huge sun, and then this lone 46, comes in out of the sun, and we're sitting up on the roof.
It is 7:50 in the morning, April 30th, 1975. It takes the 11 Marines 2 minutes to board, and by 7:52 they head out to the South China Sea.
Swift 2-2.
report, including the commander, all the Americans are out. That is it.
For a moment, we thought they really had forgotten us, you know. And I guess saying to myself, it's finally over, you know. We're finally getting out of here, you know, and going back home.
As the last Marines fly over the city, looters carry away everything they can from the empty American embassy. At 11 that morning, North Vietnam's tanks smashed through the gates of the presidential palace. Young North Vietnamese soldiers triumphantly waved the communist flag from the balcony.
It was a day of madness, and it was a day of terrific horror and sadness and humiliation for the Americans who were there. But we had to stare the Vietnamese in the face, those we were betraying. And that's why it was so painful for so many of us who were the younger officers there that last day.
When we return, we will look at how the fall of Saigon these many years later still resonates powerfully today for the American people, their politicians, and their generals. After 12 years and 58,000 American lives, it was over. Saigon was now Ho Chi Minh City. The war in Vietnam had ended not in victory, but in a rout. Ironically, in the last offensive of the war, the North Vietnamese took the same route that military planners had feared they would take 10 years earlier, when the Battle of the Ia Drang, the first decisive battle of Vietnam, stopped the North Vietnamese army in its tracks. To a bloodbath, Vietnam at least, never materialized. But more than 100,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, politicians, and intellectuals were arrested and placed in re-education camps, another name for prison camps, where many languished under terrible conditions for as long as 15 years. The fall of Saigon triggered a mass exodus of desperate refugees, the boat people they were called. While some of the stories ended happily in the United States, countless others spent years without a home in refugee camps throughout Southeast Asia. At home, the war left bitterness and division. It also left behind a reluctance to use force that's only recently been overcome. But in the Gulf War, the generals and leaders made sure not only that they had public support, but that the U.S. had overwhelming strength, and this time would win. In Washington, there is a moving memorial to the men and women who fought and died, the Wall, as it's known. It has become a place where families, veterans, and even those who oppose the war come to find closure for a conflict that still provokes debate. But for those who survived Saigon in the final days, it seems there will always be sorrow.
The fall of Saigon, I think for those of us that have been in Vietnam before, was very, very emotional. It was the day that none of us wanted to come to. We had made significant investments of our lives in Vietnam.
That last day we saw what we'd done. We betrayed the Vietnamese who counted on us. It was the feeling of shame, not at the American effort. Many Americans had died there and died bravely. But it was our failure to make sure that we left no bodies on that battlefield. We left the battlefield strewn with bodies in our honor.
A personal note, I went back to Vietnam a few years ago, back to the killing fields in the Central Highlands where I nearly died in 1965. And in what was once a landing zone running with blood, I found flowers that I brought back and placed at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. Like a lot of other veterans, I began letting go. In 1997, the first American ambassador since Graham Martin took up his post in a unified Vietnam. That ambassador, Pete Peterson, was himself a veteran of the Vietnam War, an Air Force fighter pilot who was shot down and spent 6.5 years as a prisoner of war. I'm Jack Smith. Good night.
Saigon, April the 30th, 8 o'clock. The last American helicopter on the roof of the American embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees fleeing before the advancing communist armies. This scene, in fact every scene in this report, was filmed by a UPITN camera team who chose to remain behind in the beleaguered capital to record the final victory of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese in South Vietnam. The American airlift only took a fraction of those who wanted to leave, and for hours after the last departure, scores of people still crowded onto the embassy roof in the vain hope of rescue. One of them was an American employer who tried to get all his staff out.
I had one select man that should definitely have left. I was waiting for him. He's sitting up here now, and here we are.
How do you rate the chances?
Negligible now.
Do you think the last ones have gone?
I think they're all gone. I think these people up here are committing suicide staying up here, but what can you do?
Those who failed on that last day to get a place on the helicopters and who had reason to fear the communist takeover made for the only route that still offered a chance of escape, the Saigon River. Hundreds scrambled in panic onto any boats they could reach, not caring how they got aboard or what they left behind. For all of these people, it was in fact a voyage in vain. The communists had already captured the port of Vung Tau at the mouth of the river. By an ironic coincidence, as the overloaded ships cast off, their passengers watched helplessly as the last flights of American helicopters passed overhead, making for the certain safety of the American fleet out in the South China Sea. Back in the city, normal patterns of behavior broke down. In a climate of every man for himself, American homes, offices, and stores were looted of everything. The American embassy was ransacked in a matter of hours, despite a government warning that looters would be shot on sight. What wasn't worth taking was simply junked on the streets. The junk wasn't just paper. The streets were also littered by small arms and other items of military kit thrown away by South Vietnamese soldiers. The discarded equipment even ran to tanks, some damaged, but some also abandoned intact by their crews as they fled before the communists. The South Vietnamese army began to disintegrate. Even the crack airborne units took off their uniforms and threw away their weapons. From the presidential palace, General Min ordered all troops to cease fighting, a decision that pleased at least one paratrooper we spoke to.
I'm very happy that General Min come, see? So I see very happy. I cannot say anything now.
You think it's right to stop
fighting? Yeah, that's
fighting?
right, yeah. Because the Vietnamese people all the favor more than 25 years now. So now we don't stop fighting, you know. I'm very happy, you know. Very happy for all the kids and me. All the people of the Vietnamese army.
What are you going to do yourself now?
Right now, if the police, if I don't have the job, I can take care of one taxis. I can ride around, make the money every day for my wife and my baby. Everybody happy. Don't want to fight anymore.
Not everyone saw defeat so optimistically. This officer shot himself in front of the soldiers' monument a couple of hours before the communists entered the city. And then, shortly after midday, came the climax of 30 years of fighting. The first North Vietnamese troops entered the city, packed into trucks that flew the red and blue flag of the Communist Provisional Revolutionary Government, the PRG. Minutes later, their Russian-made tanks smashed down the gates of the presidential palace and took up positions in the grounds. There was no resistance. South Vietnamese troops were soon flushed out and surrendered without a fight. So, on its final day, the communist offensive ended without bloodshed, but with a display of potential firepower that impressed even the most jaded observers of the war. The new masters in Saigon, or Ho Chi Minh City as they called it, were clearly delighted. It had been a very disciplined arrival, the result of careful and detailed planning in which every unit knew precisely where to go and what to do, and it had all gone without a hitch. Inside the palace, General Duong Van Minh, Big Minh, South Vietnam's president for only 2 days, formally capitulated. He greeted his communist captors with the words, "You have come, the revolution has come," and then declared he was handing over power to people who deserved it more than he did. He was led away with his government ministers to a waiting jeep, consoled slightly by the knowledge that his surrender broadcast had, at any rate, avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Among the thousands who arrived, there wasn't a single reported case of theft, drunkenness, rape, or shooting. People who hours earlier had feared for their lives now turned out on the streets to cheer and welcome. The sense of relief in Saigon was almost tangible. The victors seemed as concerned to win the cooperation of the vanquished as the vanquished were to give it. And indeed, such cooperation was essential, since Saigon now had no police force to control day-to-day law and order. The relaxing of tension made for an almost holiday atmosphere as the celebrations of victory got underway. The first demonstrators on the streets were the Buddhists, many of whom had long opposed the military regime in Saigon and the involvement of the Americans in the war. Other groups soon followed, and the city returned almost to normal within 48 hours. The new rulers issued warnings that looters would be shot, and the lawlessness of the last days of South Vietnam ceased immediately. As the first day of peace for 30 years dawned in Vietnam, the banks and some shops remained closed. But in Saigon's markets, it was business as usual. Prices of meat and vegetables rose slightly in the first 2 days of communist rule and then leveled out. And the city's black markets continued to flourish. There were, of course, some changes. In the main market, traders were quick to peddle a new line in flags. With virtually every building and home being decorated for the forthcoming victory celebrations, demand was brisk for the red banner with the yellow star, the national flag of North Vietnam. Lapel-sized liberation flags were also a popular choice, along with the ubiquitous posters of the man whose dream was now fulfilled, Ho Chi Minh. Though there were few immediate supply problems, the long-term future is not so secure. Saigon may, for example, become a city of bicycles like Hanoi and Peking. Petrol is scarce and costs the equivalent of up to $10 a gallon on the black market. Since nearly all South Vietnam's needs were previously met and paid for by the Americans, fuel is certain to become even more scarce and expensive. and it can't be long before most of Saigon's Hondas are driven off the streets. Another event to signal the change of regime, the pulling down of the South Vietnamese Army monument in front of the National Assembly building. It was never a popular statue with the people of Saigon. The cynics used to say it showed an American soldier pushing his South Vietnamese counterpart in front of him into battle. Its destruction was ordered by the new city government, and scores of people turned out to chip away at the two huge cement figures. After a couple of hours' frantic work, the monument was toppled amidst great jubilation. Two weeks after the communist takeover, some schools reopened. At this one, a black uniformed communist cadre began the first course in what's officially called re-education. Crowded round him were the students who would later reenact the liberation of the South in what's become the traditional communist propaganda play, the Americans and their evil reactionary allies against the People's Revolutionary Forces. Other instructors were drilling children in rehearsals for the parades and demonstrations that would form a large part of the official victory celebrations to be spread over 3 days. In the past, many students avoided conscription, especially if their fathers had enough money to bribe the right officials. But Hanoi was calling the tune now, and everyone had to march to it. The first appearance of the new authorities came a week after the military takeover. From the balcony of the presidential palace, members of Saigon's Military Management Committee addressed a mass rally of troops assembled to celebrate not only their own recent victory, but also the 21st anniversary of the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu. About 30,000 people turned out to watch. After the speeches, the inevitable parade, led by posters of Ho Chi Minh. The next day, foreign journalists had the opportunity of getting to know Saigon's new leaders better when the committee's chairman, General Tran Van Tra, held a press conference. Through an interpreter, he left no one in any doubt that he'd taken over all aspects of the city's affairs.
Closely united in their task, the revolutionary administration of the city will, together with the people, settle all problems and wipe out all difficulties.
A week later, another rally introduced the Provisional Revolutionary Government itself. On the balcony, the North Vietnamese Army Chief of Staff, and next to him, the PRG's #1, Huon Tan Pat. Then came North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho, who negotiated the Paris peace agreements, and Madame Binh, the PRG's foreign minister. All of them looked highly pleased as North Vietnamese tanks led the victory parade. A whole division of troops took part, 10,000 men. But as North Vietnam always maintained it had no troops in the south, every soldier in the parade wore the badge of the PRG. As the parade of hardware went on, the overriding impression was one of finality, that the communists had established beyond all question a tight and unopposed control over the land and people that had suddenly become theirs. And though the conquerors will brook no political opposition, they will probably hope for genuine cooperation as they move away from the art of war and towards the less spectacular but more complex art of government.
Việt Nam đi chung lòng yêu quốc, bước chân dồn vang trên đường ấm người xa. Cờ in máu chiến thắng mang hồn nước, súng quay sang trên khúc quân hình ca. Đường vinh quang xây xa quân thù, thắng sang nào cùng nhau lập chiến thù. Vì nhân dân chiến đấu không ngừng, tiến mau ra xa trường, tiến lên cùng tiến lên, nước non Việt Nam ta vững bền. Quân Việt Nam đi sao mà tốt vời, dắt dòng nòi quê hương qua đời làm hòa, cùng chung sức phấn đấu xây đời mới. Đứng đều lên gông xích ta đập tan, từ bao lâu ta nuốt căm hờn, nguyện hy sinh đời ta tươi thắm hơn. Vì nhân dân chiến đấu không ngừng, tiến mau ra xa trường, tiến lên
It is President Xi's second visit to Vietnam as China's head of state and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee. The visit comes after the APEC economic leaders meeting wrapped up in the Vietnamese city of Da Nang. President Xi's state trip aims to deepen strategic communication between the two nations and their communist parties, as well as expand the practical cooperation and people-to-people exchanges for a new era. President Xi, of course, is also General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. He is expected to hold talks with the head of Vietnam's Communist Party, Nguyen Phu Truong. There, live pictures in Hanoi, the Vietnamese capital, where a welcome ceremony is taking place to welcome Chinese President